If you would find the book of Philippians, the 3rd chapter. We've made it to the 3rd chapter, and a couple of things just to kind of think about. First of all, I do want you to know that at the Marshall House there are now 21 feet of gutter that have lights on them. Just 21 feet. Didn't do a lot, and I have to admit, it really does look pretty nice. It's white icicle lights right by the door, and the door does look nice. And in fact, whenever we do finally get lights up on the eaves or the gutters, I always think it looks so nice that I kind of like the idea of just leaving them up all year long. And I know maybe it's kind of a redneck thing, I don't know. But it just occurs to me there are reasons throughout the year that maybe it'd be nice to just have your light, birthdays, let's turn the lights on, or an anniversary, turn the lights on, or, get a promotion at work, or the kids get a good report card, just turn the lights on. In other words, there ought to be throughout all of the year some occasion and reason to celebrate. I think that's a good idea. Today, we're going to talk about this idea of joy, which in terms of decorating your house to make it look attractive, I will tell you, one of the most attractive things that you can decorate your life with is a sense of joy. That if you have a genuine sense of joy in your life, it will make a world of difference. People will see it. That will cause you to stand out in the world. And if you're going to go biblically to talk about joy as a concept, you have to go to the book of Philippians, because it is one of the unquestioned themes. There are 104 verses in the letter that Paul wrote to the Philippians. There are 19 references to joy or rejoicing or being joyful. He can't go 5 verses without talking about joy. In fact, twice he's going to give strict commands about rejoicing. So today I want us to think about the idea of joy, and frankly, there's a reminder that says it is inappropriate for you and I to live any length of time without joy as a part of our lives. So, chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. And by the way, that's a command. Rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you is no trouble to me and is safe for you. That's a bizarre thing to say. But it suggests that there is a danger of us living our lives without joy. That somehow to live our lives joylessly is a dangerous thing. And so today I want us to think about that. The 4th chapter, when he gets there, he's going to say it this way: rejoice in the Lord, and again I say rejoice. Now, one other thing I want to say, it does begin finally. You know what it means when a pastor says in conclusion? Nothing. Doesn't mean anything. He says finally, and he's only halfway through the letter. So he's got more to say, but he's going to say a lot about joy. And so the nature of joy. Joy is a difficult concept. It is an emotion, and God has made us to have emotions. The truth is that some of us tend to be more emotional than others. Some of us have higher highs and lower lows. We're not all wired exactly the same, but joy is an emotion. It's one that God has given us, but it's a complex kind of emotion. It exists on a lot of different levels. There is a sense in which joy is very much elation and excitement, jubilation. It's all big, high emotions, but I think there's a kind of joy that is a very quiet kind of joy, an immense sense of well-being. I've thought about Mary when it says she pondered. The Magi, the shepherds have come in and they've talked about the angel saying joy to the world and peace on earth, and she ponders it. I think there's a kind of joy in her heart. Holding a newborn child, there's a joy that is just a very quiet kind of joy, but it is an overwhelming sense of emotion that's in your heart. It can be loud joy. I think there's a quiet kind of joy, but joy is a difficult concept. In fact, some years ago, there was a book entitled That Elusive Thing Called Joy. And in this season where we talk about joy to the world, unfortunately, there are a lot of us who don't experience it very much. And maybe it's worth exploring. And so today, I want to suggest to you some of the sources of joy. Where does joy really come from? Where should it be coming from? In fact, I've got 9 suggestions on sources of joy that if you find yourself in this season, maybe not experiencing the kind of joy you think ought to be, there's some places that it ought to come from. So let me just give you those, and we're going to kind of walk through them because there's 9. We're not going to spend a long time on any of them in particular, but the first source of joy is obviously in the Lord. Rejoice in the Lord. So the bottom line is that joy as an emotion really is not possible if it doesn't come out of your relationship with God. That God is the source of joy. It is one of the fruits of the Spirit. The first fruit of the Spirit is love, but the second one is joy. Joy is something that comes from a spiritual relationship with the living God. The angels give the very first message about Jesus, and they say, joy to the world because of Jesus Christ. You're never going to find that joy except through Him. The Magi, when they find Jesus, finally, and they reach the place where He's at, they rejoice, and I like the way the King James says, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. They found Jesus. There is no ultimate joy apart from Jesus Christ. Now, non-Christians in this season love their families, have good times, they'll celebrate, they'll do things, but there is a quality of joy that is not possible beyond the Lord. And in all these other sources and all these other ways we're going to talk about it, if you're not experiencing joy, you either don't know Jesus Christ or you're not living in fellowship with Jesus Christ, because joy has to begin with your relationship with Him. So that's the first source. Secondly, and this is the most complicated one I know. It is the most difficult one, and it doesn't hardly even make sense, but the Bible teaches that there is a source of joy, the Lord, and one of the sources of joy is trial, is difficulty. Now, I understand it doesn't make much sense. In fact, it's one of the most bizarre things, but the book of James starts, verse 2 says, count it all joy when you face different kinds of trial. And it goes on and it says those trials will bring about patience and you'll grow in your faith. And then it goes on, and basically that's also tied to the passage that says if you lack wisdom, pray for it and God will give it to you. But it says count it all joy when you face trials. It's very similar to the Old Testament passage in Psalm chapter 30 when it says sorrow comes and lasts for the night, but joy comes in the morning. Now, there's a connection that somehow when you and I walk in trials, when we face difficulties, it seems that God works overtime in us and through us and with us and is able to give us a sense of joy even in the midst of it. Now, understand this letter that has all of these statements about joy over and over. Paul says, rejoice in the Lord. Again, I say rejoice. I got to command you to rejoice in the Lord. He's writing that from prison. And he's writing it to people who are getting ready to face tremendous persecution. And in the midst of trial, he says joy is still possible. I don't know that I ever really understand that, but I do have this concept that there is a sense that when we are in the midst of those difficulties, it enables us to experience and know and understand joy. There's an old Gaither song, Through It All. And it's all about going through trials, but it has a phrase, if I'd never had a problem, I would never know that God could solve them. It's almost that same kind of idea that you never really understand the joy of the mountaintop if you have not walked in the valley. Now, I don't know how that works out. But I understand that there is joy in the midst of trial. There is joy as you work through trial. And when you get to the end of a trial and you look back, the joy is greater because of what you've walked through. I guess all I would say is, as I thought about this, and I have had this particular passage that I was going to look at on this particular Sunday for probably 8 or 9 weeks now. But I will tell you that right now in our church family, every Sunday we come, there are people walking in trials. I mean, there's never a Sunday that we don't come in that somebody's struggling with something. I will just tell you, I think we got about more families walking through deep valleys than we've had in a long time. I mean, cancer's in about every other conversation. There are things that are going on, and it's people struggling, and they're going through all those things. And yet, I guess part of this is a word to say, no matter how dark your path may be, don't give up on joy. Don't give in to discouragement. Don't let go. God is with you, and I think God is more real in the midst of difficulties than He is when things are going great if we'll trust Him. And so the Scripture says one of the sources of joy is you look for it in the midst of those difficult times, and God will be there. So first of all, joy comes from the Lord. Secondly, it really does come in trial. Thirdly, I believe that one of God's intentions and sources for joy is marriage. I mean, first of all, one of the great pictures of joy throughout all the Bible is the wedding feast, the great wedding banquet, the idea of the thing. And by the way, I've been in about 500 weddings. I have done a lot of weddings, and about 300 in this building. And by the way, normally when we do a wedding, it's kind of my spot, and the groom typically stands right here with me. And there's a moment in every wedding, usually, in which the bride steps out from the side in the back hallway and steps into that doorway. And I just seen a lot of brides' faces, and, you know, they're pretty excited. They're pretty cranked. Some of the grooms have terror on their face. But then normally, you know, they kind of get into it, and there's a kind of joy. I mean, it really is. It's just an exciting thing, and marriage is intended to be a source of joy, and not just the wedding itself, but it's one of God's plans. One of the great sources of joy is this miracle and this gift that God gave a man and a woman when He brings them together. And obviously, there's the joy of intimacy, but there's also the joy of companionship, the joy of sharing life, the joy of going through. In other words, joy is an emotion that is not just for you, it's to be shared. And so the concept of marriage is God gives you somebody to share the joy with. God really does intend it to be a source of joy. And that principle is underscored by at least two things. One, when marriages don't make it, when they fail, the tragedy is that much greater because the joy that should have been there is not. And anybody who's had to walk through a divorce understands the tragedy, the sadness of there not having been what should have been. The joy should have been there. But I would tell you what, I've heard this, I don't know how many times, particularly from couples who have been married for, 40, 50, 60 years or more. When one of them dies, they will say almost immediately afterwards, I thought of something and I wanted to tell her. Or I read that and I wanted to say to them, or I looked over at the chair that they're always sitting in, and the hardest thing was that they weren't there to share something with. But that tells you that that's what marriage is about. It's about sharing experiences together, and in that sharing, there is a kind of joy. But understand, it's a proportional joy. That the joy that comes out of your marriage is proportional to the amount of energy and love that you put into it. But one of the sources that God says, and I think God gives us, is certainly we find joy in Him, and even in the midst of trials, and we find it in our marriage, and we find it in kids. Although sometimes I will tell you the joy is better found in other people's children than your own. Just want you to know that. And sometimes 2 years old and teenagers are kind of a challenge. But for the most part, there's a joy in children. And that's one of my other great things. I mean, I get to visit in the hospital, and I kind of make real good friends with the nurses on the maternity floor, so they kind of let me sneak in and say hello. And just to see parents holding that new child, there's a joy there. And frankly, there's something about children that they just know how to do joy better. I think the problem is we get to be adults, and I'm too adult to do that. They don't care about looking silly. They don't care about having fun. They just do stuff. They're not worried about what everybody else thinks. There's a kind of innocent abandon in children that you and I ought to learn from. In fact, if you don't have your own kids, borrow some. Don't steal any, but borrow some. Spend some time with them. Go volunteer in childcare. Work in Awanas. Be around some kids. And understand that, there's those moments, but just be around them and maybe get to the place that you and I aren't so adult that we lose some childlike joy. In fact, it's not a coincidence that Jesus says, if you're going to really approach the kingdom of God, which is joy, then you got to come like a little child. Oh, there's something good. Children. And in this particular season, that's one of the most exciting things, to be able to do things for and with children. Children are one of the sources of joy. Memories are one of God's sources. In fact, in Philippians chapter 1, the first time he uses the word joy is when he says, every time I remember you guys, every time I think about and he's seeing faces in his mind of the people in Philippi, and he says, every time I see you, I remember you, I thank God, and I have joy in my heart. Memories are a source of joy. And by the way, in the midst of grief and sorrow, one of God's greatest gifts are those memories. And by the way, the memories sometimes will bring, in those circumstances, a tear to your eye and a smile to your lips at the same time. I use that phrase in funerals a lot. But there's this sense that memories are a gift from God. And by the way, it's a gift that senior adults get better because they've been around longer. We got more stuff to remember. And we have the joys of the past. The joys of the trials and the victories, and we can look back and we've seen where God has brought us from, and we have all of those memories, and there's something good about it. And so if you're younger, just suck it up and listen to some old people remember things. Let them tell stories about when they walked uphill both ways to school through 18 feet of snow during June, and they didn't even go to school in June. Let them tell all those stories again, because those stories, those memories of life, are some of God's greatest blessings, and they're one of the sources of joy. So the Lord, trials, marriage, children, memories, the completion of a task. But you understand that diligence, steadfastness is a tremendous, importantly spiritual biblical trait. To see something true to the end. When the Magi made this huge journey, and they arrived, and it says, and they came to the place where the child was, they rejoiced with exceeding joy. Part of it was they were rejoicing because they found Jesus. Partially, they rejoiced because they just finished the trip. I mean, I assume one of them was asking every other day, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And they finally got there, and they were all excited. You understand what it is to finally reach something, to have been faithful and done something that took a long time, to graduate with a degree. Friday, our son-in-law John is getting his doctor's degree from Southern Seminary. So we're going to go down and see, he got his doctorate in music, and we're going to go celebrate that. I mean, I even practiced calling him Dr. Sullivan, and it's not right. But he's worked a long time for that. In fact, most advanced degrees, college, etc., a lot of it's endurance. You just survive to the end. And when you have accomplished something, boy, that's worth celebrating. When you start a job, when you do something, when you reach certain milestones in your life, it's why you celebrate. 50 years of marriage. Yeah, well, you've really done something. My brother, there are things I like about my brother and things I'm not too sure about. He started a project some time ago to organize all the pictures that his family has had throughout all of their life. And he ordered plastic boxes, and he was showing them to me at great detail about how there was this vacation and this vacation and this family and this family. And frankly, I was just kind of disgusted he was that organized, because our pictures are all just in a great big box. But it evidently took him a long time to get all that stuff put together. And he finally finished it. And as he was showing me, there was just a kind of satisfaction, a kind of well-being and joy that I did it. I started it and I got to the end of it. And in life, there is something about discipline, about diligence, about seeing a job through to the end, about being faithful to the end. And will there not be something about someday entering into God's presence and finally completing our life in this world and hearing the words, well done, thou good and faithful servant, enter into what? The joy of the Master. There's something good about that. Well, number 7 is nature. When I consider the works of thy hands, the psalmist talks about the world that God has made. This summer, Karen and I had a chance to go to the Grand Canyon. In fact, the single most expensive room I have ever paid for in my life was one with a view of the south rim of the Grand Canyon. So we got to see the sun come up in the Grand Canyon. see the sun go down. Just look at that, amazing. See the colors and the majesty and the immenseness. And there's something that brings a kind of joy to anybody's heart. There's something about God's creation that ought to make you. And in fact, if you're struggling with joy, you need to see some sunrises and sunsets. You need to spend some time in nature. You need to see the leaves as they're falling. You need to do something. You need to go to some national parks. You need to see some flowers. You need to find yourself and immerse yourself in nature. And that's one of the places where you find this essence and this sense of joy. I think if we ever lose our sense of wonder at what God has created, we damage ourselves. Worship. The book of Psalms over and over uses that word rejoice. It is God's plan that you and I should find joy in worship. And part of it is the joy of just being with other believers. I mean, look around at each other. Yeah, okay, I like coming to church, but I like coming to church in part because I like being with other people who know the Lord. There's a joy that comes in that. But there's a joy in worship. Now, Steve does a good job. He cannot make you have joy in worship. You will either rejoice or not, and it's your choice. We give you the opportunities. We give you songs to sing. We play the music, get the notes right. We do all the right stuff. But in the end, you and I either choose to rejoice, and the event that we put into worship has to do with whether the joy comes out. I hope you rejoice in that. And then there is that picture of heaven. Enter the joy of your master. And the most joyous moments in the book of Revelation are when people are focused on the throne and they're worshiping God for eternity. Worship is a source. And there's one other one, and it's another hard one. But I believe there is a tremendous amount of joy that comes with forgiveness. That when we understand the nature of forgiveness, we have joy. And I put it this way. One of the greatest joy robbers, one of the great killers of joy is unforgiveness. It begins with our relationship with God, and one of the great pictures of joy is the sense of being forgiven. When David in Psalm 51 cries out because of his sinfulness, he says to the Lord, "Forgive me for my sins," but then he says, "Restore to me the joy of my salvation." But then maybe the greatest picture of all of joy in the New Testament, in Jesus' parables, is that of the prodigal son, who has been away from God, he's been away from the Father, he's been estranged, and he comes back and he says, "Father, I've sinned against you." And the Father hugs him, and they kill the fatted calf, and they have this great party where it's ultimately the picture of joy. And maybe the hardest part in that parable is that while this joyous event is going on, the picture of the older brother standing outside and outside of the joy because he's not willing to forgive the younger brother. Forgiveness brings a kind of joy that's just amazing. Well, here's the bottom line. Paul thinks joy is a good thing, and I think it's a good thing. But for sometimes, some of us, it's a little elusive. Sometimes we're not very joyful. Sometimes we've become way too adult. Sometimes we've lost the wonder of joy. And Christmas really ought to be about that. It's not so much what I would say finding your Christmas spirit, it's finding the joy of the Spirit of God. And wherever you need to look for it, if you need to spend some time in nature, if you need to go hang around with some little kids, if you need to get away with your spouse for a while, if you need to do some other kinds of things, if you need to go and make some point to be in some special places of worship, somehow to get that joy back, don't give up on joy. And don't settle for a life that is less than touched by the joy that Jesus Christ came into the world to bring.